Lightfoot, and you can read all about Robert's many, many accomplishments on the front cover of your bulletin, but it is our honor to welcome him. Robert is not only an incredibly accomplished person, but he's also a part of our community of faith here at Monte United Methodist Church. We are blessed to have Robert and Caroline as part of our church family. Robert has served in so many different capacities, but we are so grateful to welcome someone who has such a storied career with NASA and now with Lockheed Martin, and we are so grateful to welcome Robert Lightfoot. Please join us in welcoming Robert. Good morning.
Don and Monte United Methodist for allowing us to recognize perhaps the most incredible achievement of humankind, at least for our generation. For those who haven't been here before, Monte has been doing this for a while, several years. I spoke about 10 years ago, I think. We were trying to figure out when it was, and I was in the other sanctuary before this one was built. So this is a beautiful place now, and I'm honored to be one of the 4 speakers you'll have this year. I will say this, when I was at NASA, I always told my protocol folks, never, never, never have me speak after a kid or an astronaut, right? So I am glad I'm going before Jan in this 4-week series. So I'm happy about that moving forward. You know, I would love to say that the moon landing, I was 6 when the moon landing occurred. I do remember it. I remember watching it and my dad explain it to me. And I would love to tell you all that inspired me greatly to go into space and move to Huntsville, Alabama, and become part of the generation that followed on the shoulders of these giants that did this for us. But really, actually, what I did is my wife of now 33 years, who I was dating at the time, Caroline, lived in Huntsville. So that's why I came to Huntsville. So I don't have one of those great stories like everybody else, right? Except that the great story I have is she stuck with me for 33 years. Talk about a giant leap. She really took one there. You know, how many folks in here were involved in the Apollo program? If you could please raise your hand. Come on, higher than that. You can do it higher than that. I see a couple. You were the giants whose shoulders I stood on in my career. You know, I wasn't part of that, but I had so many mentors and so many bosses along the way that would remind me, you know, sometimes to my chagrin, well, this is the way we did it in Apollo, right? And tell us and remind us how we may not have been doing as well as they did in those days. But what always amazed me was when you asked those team members, did you know you were making history by sending humans to the moon? Almost every single one of them said, I was just doing my job. Humble servants, just trying to make this huge thing happen. And I'm reminded of the story that Ken Mattingly used to tell about standing there in front of the rocket before he got to fly. And he asked the technician, is this thing going to be okay? Going to get me to the moon? And the technician said, I don't know about this, but this part I'm working on is going to be fine. So I think that was the approach that most people took. Focus on your piece, and the whole thing will come together very well. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about what it takes to create a giant leap. You know, we talk about what Neil Armstrong and his team, and then I want to share my take as a Christian on the pursuit of such endeavors and how much the journey of Christianity has remarkably similar characteristics to the giant leap that Neil Armstrong made nearly 50 years ago. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have met all 3 members of the Apollo 11 crew. I actually had dinner with Neil Armstrong one night. Okay, so it was the Davidson Center with 1,000 of my closest friends. But I did get to sit next to him. And I remember telling my photographers at Marshall, because I was the center director, I remember telling my photographers, you miss this picture, you're done, right? And so my parents had this picture of me and Neil Armstrong looking like we're engaged in tremendous conversation, which we were. But I can tell you the one thing that I remember about that more than anything, and Caroline reminded me because she was sitting with me, she reminded me last night when we were talking about this, that all he talked about was what his wife was doing in education, right? Very humble, quiet man, very private man, for those of you that have paid attention to his life. You'd never know he was the first person to walk on the moon. He's perfectly happy with that being the situation. Buzz Aldrin, well, Buzz is Buzz. He's a passionate explorer. still involved at, I think, 89 now. I saw him in March, and he's wearing me out about how we need to get to Mars. I'm not there anymore. I don't work at NASA, you know. And he's just so passionate about what he wants to do. He wants us to keep exploring. He wants us to make sure it's there. Mike Collins, who they called the loneliest man in the universe, as he flew the Columbia command module while Buzz and Neil were down on the surface of the moon. You know, I forget how many revolutions of the moon, all by himself, right? They would have to check in. I saw, if you haven't seen the documentary Apollo 11, where they just pieced together some film. I think CNN Films did it. Anyway, it's fantastic. I encourage you to do it. There's no actors. It's just piecing together film from the entire mission. And they talked to Mike one time. They checked in with him, make sure he's okay, and said, I guess, you know, because Buzz and Neil are down playing on the moon, right? He's up there floating around, and they said, well, I guess you're the only person in the universe that doesn't have your TV on, because he didn't have no way to see what was going on. And he kept going, is it going okay? Yeah, it's going fine. So what an interesting place to be, but another very humble, quiet man who has plenty of stories. It just stays out of the public spotlight. And I think the cool thing about those three gentlemen, while they were tremendous heroes, one thing that I always admired about them is their great appreciation for the teams here on Earth. Those of us that were terrestrially bound, as I say, that didn't get the chance to fly. They knew that the hundreds of thousands of people that supported them and allowed them to get to do what they got to do, but they didn't do it for them. They did it for the entire world, really, from that standpoint. They also were ones that would tell you that it came with sacrifice. You think about Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, Ed White, that we lost in Apollo 1. You think about that, and their tragic loss is probably one of the only reasons we succeeded in getting to the moon, because of the changes that we put in place from that loss. You never want that to happen. But that's you'll hear me talk about it later. That's one of the things about these giant leaps. They come with risk, and they come with tragedy at times. It took me a while to figure out what I was going to say today, and you know, you're over the next 3 weeks, you're going to hear some pundits and speakers all over the world, a lot smarter than me, and they'll reflect on this giant leap. So I thought what I'd do, instead of talking about what we did, I'd talk about what it took to actually, the key elements of a giant leap, and the things I think are necessary to make that happen. So when you think about a giant leap, you know, really, the leap is the end of a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Think about it. Someone leaps into the end zone to score a touchdown. Football fan, sorry for the analogy. But that comes with years and years of practice. The person that scored that touchdown probably it started when they were 10, 11 years old. All this preparing them to score that touchdown. You think about one of our soldiers coming home, and you see the families leap into each other's arms as they come home. That's because they had practice, they had preparation, they had the equipment that we needed them to have, right? That moment was the leap. But allowing them to have that leap was because we had done so much to get them ready. The leap is truly the last step in a long journey of many, many steps. Every giant leap has a few components. I actually wrote routine components, which is really kind of funny. These are not routine. They have a few components. I'll focus on 5 particular things. I think you'll find a lot in our history have 3 to 4 of these, but very few have all 5. And I think that's what makes it a giant leap. The first is someone provides that sustained vision for something greater than themselves. If you think about John F. Kennedy in 1961 making his speech at Rice Stadium to say, hey, we're going to the moon. We're going to bring them back. He even described the rocket, 300 feet. I mean, we hadn't even built it yet. You know, and he described it almost perfectly. And if you watch that documentary I'm talking about, at the end they actually play his speech, not the part where he says that we're all famous with, but the whole speech. It's pretty fascinating what he did. But it took the strength of those after JFK, after his assassination. It took LBJ, it took Nixon, it took the Congresses to maintain that vision. These are not short duration activities. They take a while. And it takes vision over time to be able to make that occur. If you think about the vision has to be there longer than the visionary is in place. Longer than the visionary is in place. And if you think about our 24-hour world we're in, the attention span is terrible. Our attention span as society is just brutal, right? You know, you're going from earthquakes to what did the Kardashians do yesterday, right? That's our world we're in. 5 minutes. Most of you probably forgot my name. But that's the kind of attention span we're dealing with, right? If you think about the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station, how many people have seen it fly above? Raise your hand. If you haven't, Google it, watch it. It's a beautiful sight. You'll see it. It pretty much explains how to see it and everything. If it's flashing lights, by the way, it's an airplane. It's not the station. Be aware of that. Don't get confused. But the International Space Station survived by one vote in 1994 in Congress. One vote. All right? It survived over 30 changes of leaders in the countries, changes of parliaments, Congress, depending on what country it was. Survived it. And now it's up there as a floating lab. It's the cornerstone and the leaping point for us to take humans further into space. That's sustained vision. That's what takes time to get us there. And if you think about the kids that graduated from college, or from high school this year, pretty soon it'll be college, we're getting close. Kids that graduated from high school this year, none of them have lived a day in their lives without someone moving in space. Not the same person. But remarkably, we've had people on the International Space Station that long. So it's pretty fascinating. When we think about vision, that's what vision is long term. The next thing that has to happen in a giant leap is it has to be civilization changing. Okay? That's not a small accomplishment when you say that, right? In other words, think really big. We landed on the moon for the first time. The entire Earth said, we did it. If you look at the newspapers, yes, there were newspapers back then, and you think about what we call above the fold in my world, where they're folded in half on your front step. We did it all over the world. Not NASA, not the United States, the entire world celebrated that accomplishment. At NASA we talked all the time about, and still talk about, finding life elsewhere rather than Earth. Now we're headed to a small moon of Jupiter called Europa, which has conditions that might harbor a life. Not life like us walking around, but life that adjusts to the environment that it's in some organic form. We've identified over 1,000 what we call exoplanets, which is a fancy way of saying planets that look like they're probably in the right zone for their particular star to have the same conditions we have here on Earth. Thousands. When you use those telescopes John was talking about in Children's Moment, we've seen that. Can you imagine the first time we confirm life somewhere else in the universe? Or the HD broadcast of the first landing on Mars? Those first steps there. I think we'll all be glued to the television or whatever we have done when that happens. And those will be civilization-changing events. The third thing that has to happen is a leap requires a substantial advancement in the status quo. Right? In other words, not a few steps, but a true leap. A true change in what we think. If you think about the incremental improvement we have today in communications before satellites, telephones, it took a long time to make those changes. Today we all have iPhones or whatever it is we choose, Samsung, whatever you choose. I don't want to pick to be your choice, and very few people have landlines anymore, right? So you see those kind of changes, and yet when you think about going to the moon, the steps that were required, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all those steps were built to allow us to get to the moon and change that status quo. The fourth thing that has to happen is it has to be something that inspires and unites people. I talk about the emotion of space. Engineers are not supposed to have emotions. We're supposed to just be these, guys that just make things happen. And there's no emotion involved in space. At one time, there was a lady that had written the NASA administrator and asked, why are we spending all this money on exploration in space? Can you explain it to me? And instead of explaining it to her, he said, look, this is what we do, this is why we do it. Pretty cut and dry like the engineer was. But invited her to a shuttle launch. How many people have seen a space shuttle launch? Raise your hand. Okay, so you guys are going to live this with me a little bit. So he told her, you have to send me a note back about what you learned when you went to that space shuttle launch. So, sure enough, and my wife has confirmed this as she sat at a couple launches, I never got to sit outside and watch a launch. I was always in the firing room, which, based on the story she tells me, is pretty kind of terrible. That I didn't get to experience this. But the big moment is T-minus 9 minutes. T-minus 9 minutes is when they do the poll of all the people that have systems on the shuttle, right? It's when you're asked go, no go. And that's a pretty interesting moment, especially when you're sitting. I was there post-Columbia, when we lost Columbia, and you're sitting there and you're asked go, no go. And I happened to be in charge of all the propulsion systems at Marshall at the time. It's a pretty interesting moment. You think about it beforehand, but when it actually happens, you're sitting there going, wow, I'm about to send 7 of my friends into space. I sure hope the systems are good. Right, and you begin to trust all the training you've done and everything you've done to that point. So T-minus 9 minutes, they go through the pole. There's a bit of I don't know, I call it celebratory attitude out in the viewing area. People are running around, getting Cokes and, popcorn, whatever they're doing. Not really settled yet because we're not close. Launch conductor says, okay, we're going to come out of the count on my mark. And then the clock starts, and there's this huge clock out there. It starts counting down. You hear and it gets a little bit quieter. People start settling down. T-minus 5 minutes, they play the national anthem. Right? You talk about, I'm getting goosebumps sitting up here. Talk about pulling on your patriotism. You play the national anthem. About T-minus 2 minutes, it gets really quiet. People are sitting there. Nobody's stirring. Nobody's doing much. With 7 humans, Jan can probably describe this a lot. She can describe what it looks like from where she was sitting. Not from the stands 3 miles away. T-minus 31 seconds, we go to auto sequence start. At that point, computers have it. T-minus 6 seconds. The main engine start. We start the main engine 6 seconds before because once the booster's light, you're going somewhere, and you want the main engines to be good. Now, I worked on main engines in my career. We did a lot to make sure the main engines were good. So, main engine's light, they're up to main stage at 6 seconds, and the booster's light. Now, by the way, when you're out 3 miles away, you hadn't heard a thing yet. It's all visual. You're seeing the smoke here, you see the boosters go here, and the shuttle lifts off. It clears, about the time it gets above the tower, the rumble hits you. Your shirt starts flapping. Your pants start flapping. It's incredible. This lady wrote back to the administrator and said, I'm sitting there and tears are running down my face. And she goes, I have no idea why. No idea why. That's the inspiration of space and doing something larger than yourself. There's a particular book called Joy, Inc. It's written by Rich Sheridan, who I've gotten to know a little bit over time. He runs a small innovative company in Detroit, Michigan. And the book's about what motivates and drives people to succeed. And he has a particular passage in that book that struck me when I read it. I mean, I stopped and wrote it down in my notes that I keep around leadership and things. And he says, talked about the inspirational value or why certain things succeed and others may not. At the time the Wright brothers flew for the first time, their main competition was a guy named Samuel P. Langley, Langley Research Center, really known as the father of aeronautics for our country. Yet the Wright brothers beat him to first flight. Why? And Sheridan surmises this. He said, Langley wanted to build an airplane. The Wright brothers wanted to fly. That subtle difference is what makes the difference with a giant leap when it comes to inspiration. The last thing you got to have is you got to be able to accept risk and endure failures along the way. As I said, many from the Apollo days have told me the tragedy of Apollo 1 is what provided the impetus for the follow-on to be successful with Apollo 11. In today's risk environment, we'll be able to attempt such a bold mission with that kind of risk. The risk for that mission was 50-50. 50-50. That's pretty amazing. But then you think about giant leaps that we've had or things that we've done from a risk standpoint as this nation. We just celebrated D-Day, the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Did you know that that Eisenhower knew there were going to be 1 and 2 soldiers? We're going to lose 1 and 2 soldiers, but the benefit was worth it. We needed to do that to secure peace in this whole entire earth. We must acknowledge that there's going to be risk with the next giant leap, or any giant leap. And there are going to be failures along the way, and it'll take leadership and lots of it to get through that. The reward always has to be there and has to be well articulated. We've lost 17 astronauts during spaceflight in the pursuit of this grand journey of exploring the unknown. It is never, or never will be, without risk. And the leadership that's required is the same as those sending brave men and women into battle that we've done for years. We do it for the right reason, have great confidence in our teams and brilliance and the brave souls training to get through the things that are thrown at them. Yet there will be mistakes and there will be failures. To make that next leap, will we learn from those and keep going, or will we cower away because we cannot tolerate failure? What if we'd stopped after the loss of Apollo 1? Would we have ever walked on the moon? Would somebody else have walked there first? What if we stopped after the loss of Challenger, the great observatories like Hubble, Chandra, that Greg works on today? The beginnings of the International Space Station would have never been achieved. And what if we'd stopped after the loss of Columbia? We would have never completed the amazing national laboratory that we call the International Space Station today. And we would have done it as a dishonor to those that actually did risk their lives and knew they were risking that. Leadership and management is as follows. Managers do things right, leaders do the right things. Knowing when to be a leader and when to be a manager will help us make that next giant leap. It took even stronger leadership to continue through the failure of Apollo 1, and that's what it'll take for the next giant leap. So for today, those are my 5 components for a giant leap. What we did for Apollo, sustained vision, civilization changing, advancement far beyond the status quo, inspiration, and smartly addressing the risks and failures that are sure to come from such an endeavor. And while I can't predict what the next giant leap will be, I do believe it will require as a minimum all that I have shared, and I think I've got lots of scar tissue from my days at NASA to say that's probably what it's going to be. Maybe some other things too, but there would definitely be these 5. And how blessed are we to be part of this community here in Huntsville, Alabama, that allows us to participate in such things, right? We could be in the middle of the next giant leap right now, taking steps with SLS and Orion to take people back to the moon and ultimately onto Mars. We just don't know it, right? Because we haven't done it yet. The leap hadn't occurred, but it will. Guarantee it will. Now, to tie that back to my own discussion from a Christian point of view, I also believe the other giant leap was the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Think about it. Sustained vision. The prophets of the Old Testament told us over and over and over again what was going to happen and how it was going to work. Jesus himself told us while he was on this earth what was going to happen. Civilization changing. Christianity became a religion like no other, and still today works to bring the message to all parts of the world. John talked about it in his prayer this morning. Advancement far beyond the status quo, but Jesus taught us was the message of God's grace. Something we hadn't talked about before. Jesus washed the feet of others. He ate with the unclean. He changed the status quo. Inspirational. Our religion is based on love for one another and forgiveness when we fail. Now, we will fail. We all do. We're human. But the forgiveness is there. And risk. Just ask Peter, who denied his Lord 3 times. Just think about all the missionaries who've gone in to try to preach the word and haven't survived. That doesn't mean we quit. That doesn't mean we stop. We quit going because it's important. The song, The Lord of the Dance. One of my favorites because I'm a Camp Simatonga kid. I used to be the hike dude there for 2 years back in my early days. Last verse, of course, this is with the resurrection. This is when the roll will rock away. They cut me down, and I leapt up high. I am the life that will never, never die. That was Jesus' giant leap for mankind. As Christians, scientists and engineers are often asked about exploring and looking for life beyond Earth. How do we reconcile that? As if it's something sacrilegious, I guess. So I've always used the first verse of the classic hymn, How Great Thou Art, for my inspiration in this area. And don't worry, I'm not going to sing it, but I'll say it. If you don't want me after that, I'm not going to sing anything ever again. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. God created the heavens and earth, and he created us in his image so that we can think and pursue knowledge and explore. Whether crossing the Atlantic, moving across North America to the West Coast, trekking to the North Pole, or leaving our planet to walk on the moon. Exploration was written in our hearts and in our DNA. Hearts and DNA provided by God. Thank you very much. Amen.